Alrighty, gang. Here's to nights that turn into mornings and friends that turn into family. Cheers!
Happy birthday to you.
Hello. Welcome to the Friendship IRL podcast. I'm your host, Alex Alexander, and each week we explore what's working and what's not in our friendships, community, and connections. Have you ever wished you could sit down and have a conversation about what is really going on in your friendships? Well, you found your people. Join us as we dive into real-life stories and explore new ways to approach these connections. Together, we're reimagining the rules of friendship. Today's episode started with a question, and it was actually posed by our guest, Donna Fields. I'll tell you a little bit more about her in a minute, but before Donna and I even hit record, the question was, how do we balance community and independence? Now, I'm not saying that today's episode answers that question, probably far from it. I feel honestly a little bit more confused, which I think is a good thing. I think we all get a little bit more confused when we're trying to untangle. But so often on this podcast, we talk about how our small everyday actions add up to the broader sense of community and connection and friendship in our lives, how it's the little things. Even though you might want to wave a magic wand and have it be all different, that isn't how it works. It requires us to be really thoughtful and intentional about these little things we're doing day in and day out. Now, if you are Donna, you make a big, brave, bold move. 20 years ago, Donna moved to Spain. And Spain is a very collectivist society, very communal, very different than the States where Donna is from, which is, as we've covered many times in this podcast, a very individualistic society. And I would imagine, because I have not done this myself, that when you make that move, it becomes very apparent that those tiny little actions you're taking day in and day out are so different than the people you are now surrounded by. I want to read you this line from one of the very first messages Donna sent me. She wrote, "Even after 20 years, it's humbling to reconsider the way I was brought up in the American insistence on independence." And I think that sums it up. When you move somewhere where everything feels so different and you're wondering to yourself, what is my balance? What feels right to me? In that same message, Donna continued, she says, "I've traveled around the world and I'm still traveling. And I wonder, what are we looking for when we leave one place to go to another? Family? Community? Which is exactly what the Spaniards have right in front of them. But are they too communal? Do their family ties literally tie them down when they could have more experiences if they were allowed to cut loose?" Now, again, I am not saying we answered this question in this episode, but I do think we have a very interesting conversation on our hands. You've heard a little bit about Donna and her career accolades. There are many of them are not necessarily relevant to this episode. Like, she is just here as her today, not as Donna Lee Fields with a PhD, who is also an author and a professor and a teacher trainer and a collaborator with international education institutions. That is still her, but we're talking a little bit more about her personal life today. I do feel like Donna and I have some synchronicity, so although I don't understand exactly what Donna does, I think somebody out there might. I'm going to tell you about it. Donna specializes in innovative language and content teaching, including the CLIL approach and phenomenon-based learning. Now, you all know I love a friend of a friend, so I feel like somebody out there needs to know Donna. If that's you, send me a message. I'll connect you. With that, let's get to today's episode. Hi, Donna. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing in this conversation we're about to have today. How are you doing?
Great. I really appreciate your having me here. I was thinking about this before, and, just your energy, it feels like a very safe place to be. It feels like falling onto a lot of cushions.
Oh,
so that's my impression of speaking with you. And it comes from the heart.
I appreciate that. I try. That's very meaningful that, I really do want this to be a place where we can have maybe conversations we would have in person, like on my couch or at a cafe or something like that. But we're just lucky enough to get to share those. And with that, let's talk about some stuff that makes up your view, because I'm really excited about today's episode. Will you tell everybody a little bit about where you live and how long you've lived there?
Sure. And then ask me any questions if I'm not being clear. My mind goes, jumps around, and sometimes I'm not as linear as I could be. So I apologize to the listeners, in advance. But I'm originally from New York. I lived in New York City after I graduated from college. I traveled around the world for a year because I thought I really need to mature in certain ways, and I'm not doing it staying in New York. So I traveled around the world. At that time, we could hitchhike around the world, which was amazing. I had a plane ticket that, flew me from one country to another, but hitchhiked through New Zealand, hitchhiked through Australia, hitchhiked through Europe a little bit. And then I went back to New York, wasn't happy, did the nightlife. There was something missing. And I went to New Mexico, nice and quiet, peace, found my people in Santa Fe, people who just looked more deeply at issues. I became a teacher, found that I love teaching, love it. Although now what I say is I love helping people learn. It's a huge difference. And at some point in New Mexico, I was there for a little more than a decade and just loved it, just absolutely loved it. But it's important as a teacher to speak Spanish. And at the time, the Spanish embassy was giving grants to come over to Spain free, which was incredible.
Wow. Yeah.
And I thought, oh, okay, I'll go over for a month or so, learn Spanish, and go back to my school. And I've been here now. I'm in Spain for more than 20 years. So it really works. I'm not sure why. I believe in the universe. I try to listen to the messages the universe sends me. And for the time being, it's telling me you're here still and there's no reason to leave yet. So I make the most of it.
I mean, if it feels right, it feels right.
It really does feel right. I really don't make big decisions. I think about options and I get a sense of whether I should act on them or not. I've always done that, and I do it even more now. And it works. There's something about where I live and me that works together. And I am really a New Yorker still. And that really creates conflicts a lot of times with Spaniards in general and Valencians in particular, because they are very slow and they see life in a particular way, which I admire. And I think you'll appreciate this, Alex. It's in New York, especially, and in the United States in general, we believe that working is the most important thing. And we identify ourselves through our jobs. And here, the people really identify themselves by what they do after their jobs, what they do after they clock out. And for me, that's still a challenge. It's still a challenge. I mean, if I can just share a really short story to explain that.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, well, my neighbors, for instance, I've lived at the beach for more than 20 years. Absolutely loved it. I still have my house there. I now rent it out most of the time because the summers are crazy and I like peace and quiet. So I bought a house up in the mountains where I am now. And I live in this absolutely wonderful neighborhood. I mean, incredible neighborhood. I did not pick it. The universe picked it for me because everything is perfect for me. And I think we're going to be talking about community soon. And I found community without even realizing I was looking for it. My neighbors, for instance, he's in his 40s, so intelligent, incredibly intelligent and talented, but he was bored to death in school. And when he was in school, he could leave at 15 years old, left his studies, which means that he began working at 15, but now has no certification. And in Spain, you can't do anything without certification. And so I felt my job was to find him a better job. And I offer him ways to get more money, have more prestige. I was doing this for the first 2 years I lived here, thinking he's going to thank me. Kept saying no. He said, no, I'm not interested. Just recently, he said at his new job, they're offering German lessons so that they can send some of their employees to Germany. And I said, oh my God, that's perfect. I'm still doing it to him. But what I realized is that they are satisfied with what they have and they make the most of it. It's not like it's a community that comes home and watches TV. They come home and they do things with their family.
Yeah, which is such a perfect tie-in to today's episode, I am so interested, and I do think about this a lot. We have some friends who are expats, and we've spent some extended periods of time with them in Europe. The culture, like we talk about this in the US, right? The hyper individualized culture, the focus on work and your output as your identity. I do a lot of reading in the background about what has deteriorated that community feel in the US and led to this hyper individualization, one of which is TV. It's just every part of it is so different than what most people are experiencing in the US. And I actually didn't know that you were from New York, because I have heard from a lot of people in New York that it is closer to that European feel of being like out and about and not just like shut up in your home all the time. You're like out doing things with people. So that makes this even more interesting.
Huh. That is interesting because people are out and about doing things, but it's doing things. It's not being introspective. It's the doing that we think is getting us somewhere. And that's actually not true. And I think you probably agree with me that just doing something, being on the street, going to lunch with people, going to dinner with people constantly, going to Broadway shows, which I love. But the doing is not the goal, I don't think. So in Europe, they do that, but it's because the houses in general, I'm generalizing, the houses are small, the apartments are small. And so they get out of the house because there's no reason to be in the house. They were made to just be there to eat and to sleep.
Yeah.
So it's a much more communal environment. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, in thinking about it, because I do think that in the US, a lot of community and friendship is so focused on if you're going to be together, if you're going to make the effort to be with other people, there kind of needs to be like a reason, right? So you're going to do something, or you are there to like share deeply, be vulnerable, open up. Like there's a reason. There's almost like an output kind of, right? Where we started talking about that, identified by their jobs. We're doing that to our relationships. And I think what I've noticed in my time in Europe is whether you're in somebody's home or you've gone out to sit in a cafe for like an endless period of time with no end time where you just hang out, you're actually just existing together. Whether some deep conversation happens or you go see a show or you go on a walk, like it's less about the end result and more about just being together. Now that we're talking this through, I think is the difference.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Where in Europe in particular are you thinking?
Italy.
Interesting. Okay. The reason why I ask is because in Valencia, I've lived in Valencia for more than 20 years, so I can't speak for other places, but usually the Spanish see speaking as an art form and they speak a lot. And so just existing in a cafe is not acceptable. You need to speak. And so my experience is I would love to just sit and exist with someone because I love that the energy mixes. My experience here is that people need to verbalize everything, and it drives me a little crazy. Still drives me a little crazy.
By existing, I don't mean not talking. What I mean is you could be talking, but it could just be observations about the people walking by. It could be random musings about some thought you had while you were brushing your teeth this morning. It's more of just this kind of like stream of consciousness, conversation, curiosity. I saw this show. Do you think it'll get extended? Like random thoughts that I think a lot of people are having on their own versus I think in a lot of US culture, if you're going to get together with someone, it is to like catch up on life most of the time. Very rarely, I'm generalizing too, do you just kind of sit around and talk about what's ever on your mind. That is seen as like reserved for only your closest of people, I think.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say, and tell me if I'm not getting it, is you like the elasticity of being with someone just casually. Is that close?
I think there's a lot. Yeah, I think there's a lot of power in our connections when we are together simply to be together and not for a specific purpose.
Yeah, I'm trying to connect with what you're saying because we've had very different experiences, and I haven't been in the States in a while. And the friendships I had in the States are very different than the ones I have now. I'm just trying to find a platform that would make sense to me. For instance, when I was in the States, I could take walks with friends and we didn't necessarily need to say anything. That's my favorite. That's my favorite sort of construction. Yeah. And even in New York, I'm trying to remember what my friendships were like in New York, but mostly was, verbalizing life. So it could be exactly what you're talking about, but it doesn't resonate exactly. So we'll keep talking and see if we get there.
Yeah, it also could not.
Yeah.
That's okay too. So much of this podcast is just like throwing things out there and seeing if it does connect. Now, let's note, this is a sitting on the couch type of conversation. This is just me throwing some thoughts out, my observations. When I go to Europe, only go for a trip, right? I'm there for a few weeks at a time. And when I go, I'm always trying to verbalize why I feel like it's so different there. And I don't think I quite have the words yet, but the difference to me is palpable. And I am trying to figure out how to explain it or like what exactly it is. So for now, these are just my thoughts and observations. If you have thoughts and observations, I would love to hear them. If you have spent extensive amounts of time in a very community-oriented place, perhaps you've lived there for months or years, reach out. Tell me about it. I would love to hear your thoughts because I know there's a difference. I just can't verbalize it very well. And in the meantime, maybe we should everybody can help me convince Michael that we need to move there for a bit for research purposes, obviously.
Well, tell me what you think about this, because what I've really been sort of struggling with, and it is a struggle for me because it's not natural for me to dig into community. I love being by myself, but I'm a human and humans need to connect. So I was thinking a lot about the year that I was traveling. What was I looking for? What are we looking for when we travel? People look for different things. What I was looking for, I realized when I got back, was a family. I was looking for people that I loved being with. And here in Spain, people are very, very family oriented. It's, the first, second, third, fourth, fifth priority. Family is everything. If someone asks you something, you must do it. And it's reciprocal, absolutely reciprocal. So there's something golden about that. And for Americans, it's very difficult to watch them have their ties are so tight because we are very independent and they don't travel. Or if they do, they will travel as a pack. And so for me, that's difficult. And yet, what am I looking for? A very comfortable and safe place to be. So why would I look at them askance? Why would I even think of judging them when they're doing exactly what I've been searching for to a certain extent? So how does that sit with you?
Well, I mean, I spend a lot of time on this podcast, right, talking about how hyper individual Western society is. And I mean, really this idea in the US, when we think of a unit, like a person, right, is each person comes together and they might be a part of a family unit or a group or whatever. And then that person, if they want to enrich their lives, will go out and find more people. They will join community organizations. And that's like a personal benefit. When in reality, the definition of society is that there are groups, normally family units, that is the base. Like that's ground zero. That's the foundation, is a family unit. And then you have to participate in society because participation is what keeps society going. I think it would be fascinating to move somewhere where that is the way it works. Like, it sounds like that's how it's working in Spain. And obviously that's not my day to day. So because I do this work, I would love to see how that functions on the daily, because I think that blows a lot of Americans' minds. That's just not how we grow up thinking. I just want to explain a little bit further here, because sometimes that's really hard to do in the midst of an episode. And even what I'm about to expand on here for you is multiple episodes worth if I really dove deep. So we're just going over the synopsis. But there is there are many books, but the book I pulled off my shelf right now, the one that I think was kind of popping in my mind when we did this episode, was a book that I've talked about before. It's called Bowling Alone by Robert D. Putnam. Now, caveat to this, talking about this book was written in 2000. And although I think there is a lot of great stuff in this book, if you pick this up and you read it, remember it was written in 2000, it has a lot of stats and figures that I would bet a lot of money were not very diverse studies. So take that with a grain of salt. Now, in chapter 9 of this book, they are talking about how there is the demise of social groups. And I don't mean cliques and friend groups. What I mean is clubs and societies and organizations. Studies show that Americans are spending less and less time involved in social groups, Rotary or the Mountaineers or community civic organizations, local government, things like that. As this decline has happened, we no longer identify with these groups, right? In previous generations, you would join these groups and it would become almost a part of your identity, a second family, a way you identified yourself, a group of people that you were very closely entwined with. Churches, another decline in attendance example. Because we are not participating that way anymore, and because American society is so hyper-individual, we see each other as individual blocks, and we can come and go as we please in these groups. If you are even deciding to join one of these groups, you are just an individual in the group that can leave at any time. And because of that, these smaller groups, these civic groups and organizations and volunteer organizations, are merely an occasion for us to show up and focus on ourselves in the presence of others. I'm pulling that from page 152 in Bowling Alone. So basically this idea that before you would show up to the group, you would become a part of the group, you would give to the group, they could call on you, you could call on them, and we saw these groups as the building blocks. Now, we are an individual who is merely showing up because we want to work on a certain skill or save the environment or have a certain change that we want in local government. It is much more about what I want and how I want to feel as a person versus these groups being the building blocks. That's what I'm trying to say here. Now, this can also be family units. Again, it can be churches, it can be volunteer organizations, it can be social clubs. There are all these groups. But when you really start to think about it, it is kind of, and maybe it's just me, but I think it's kind of mind-boggling that really the purpose of the group isn't the group. The purpose of the group is for me as an individual to feel a certain way. And I hope that in this very short narration segment, I'm getting that out here clearly, because I do think I could talk about this for a lot longer. But that is what I'm trying to get at here. And I would imagine that you moving there, if society is built on these family units, not being a part of one is very challenging.
Yes, thank you. That's absolutely right. And that's been very isolating. And so that's why this community is very interesting to me, because I'm not part of their family. I'm absolutely not a family member, but there is a dependence. I've implicated myself enough, or rather, I should say, they've implicated themselves in my life to a certain extent that I've accepted, so that there is this reciprocity. So, just for instance, this is when it really hit me that I was in a community. I went to the airport a couple of months ago and I actually forgot my passport.
Oh, no.
It's the first time in my life I did it. And it was the first time also that I went there with a couple of hours waiting. So I called my neighbor. There was nothing else I could have done. I called my neighbor, and as the words came out of my mouth, I could not believe I was asking him. I said, could you please go up to my house, get my passport, and come to the airport and give it to me, which is an hour away. So it was a 2-hour trip for him. And he did it. No questions asked, nothing. And it still gives me chills, because in the States, what we do is maybe ask and then offer to pay a lot of money for it. I had one neighbor many years ago scream at me because I offered to pay her for it because she took me to town. It was a 10-minute trip. And I said, here's money for gas. And she screamed at me. She said, that is not how it works here. I do it because I wanted to do it.
I have heard that from other people, an acquaintance, a loose connection. I think they lived in the UK. It's like an old coworker of my husband's, but we were just chatting at this gathering one time, and they had moved back and they had a new baby. And I said, oh, are you happy to be here? Do you miss it? And they said, we really miss it, because what we've realized is exactly what you're saying. Like here, because we're so hyper individualized, like we can't imagine that somebody would just help us simply just to lend a hand and pass that reciprocity around. You'll be there when they need you. And they said when they were in the UK that they met these people, and they, I think in their building or something, they would watch their new baby because they didn't have any family nearby, and they kept trying to pay them. And at a certain point, the neighbors had to sit them down and say, this is offensive. And I think you really need to examine why. Like, we just want to help you.
Yeah.
We enjoy new babies. I think they were older ladies that really miss their grandkids, and we're like more than happy to watch these kiddos. And I do think about that quite often. Like, we need to examine why we feel like nobody would help us if it wasn't for money.
Well, there's something else we do, Alex, and I think that it's also really important that we consider this, because in the States is so big, and I didn't realize how big it was until I lived here for a few years, that if we don't agree with someone, or if we have an argument, it doesn't matter. We can, never see them again, or we move to a different state, or, there's so many options we can do because it's so big. And I realized that here, when you're in a smaller country and a smaller town, you really need to pay attention to how you speak to people, because you are going to see them again. The first couple of months I was here, I went into a store and I was a typical New Yorker. I demanded things and I wanted fast service. And that woman, the store owner, 20 years later remembers that. And I could never resolve that issue. But from that time, I realized that you can't highlight your culture without understanding the culture you're living in. And one of the really golden parts of this is to become more compassionate, more understanding, more patient. And yeah, the hyper individualism doesn't work everywhere. Works great in the States, and it doesn't work in other places.
Yeah. Well, and it doesn't need to. I mean, that's the joy, right? Is they've set it up. I've talked about this in some speeches I've done recently. I don't think I've talked about it on the podcast, but it so perfectly aligns with this idea. It's like when we live in this hyper individual situation mindset, you are constantly living in like a sense of hypervigilance because you can't mess up.
Wow, that's powerful. Can you explain that a little more?
Yeah. So the passport situation, if you couldn't have called your neighbor, you probably would have had to come back and you would have missed your flight. You can't ever make an accident. So before you leave the house, you have to panic and double check that you have your passport 12 times because the repercussions are really big. Now that's your example. The example I've been using when I'm speaking is we went out of town, I think for a wedding, maybe a month ago. And I realized that I forgot to stop our mail. Now, that's not that big of a deal, except that a pair of shoes I had ordered, new tennis shoes, were delivered early. So I got a notification that we had a delivery, and I panicked and thought, oh no, those $100 tennis shoes that I bought are going to sit out front. And we live on a decently busy street, like a number of people walk by, and it's very exposed. Like it's not like it's hidden up on some porch out of the way. Like people can see it. We've never had a problem with the package being stolen, but I thought to myself, oh, shoot, I should have remembered to do that small task and stop our mail, even though I didn't expect any packages to come. I should have done that. I messed up. And now because of it, somebody might take these shoes, and that's a bummer. I'm going to worry about that all weekend. And then I thought to myself, you know what? I do have the phone number for the ladies that live on either side of us. I'll just text them and, ask if they'll walk over. It's like a 30-second ask, right? Grab them off our porch and throw them in their house. And they did. And the shoes were fine. But it really made me think that when we have to do everything ourselves, we can't forget anything. If you forget anything, there's a repercussion. And the mail example is small, but the other one I've been using is if you have let's say a 5-year-old kid in the States, and they're coming home on the bus, and you got caught in traffic, that's not even your fault, and you're going to be 5 minutes late. The amount of anxiety you would have about the fact that your 5-year-old is going to walk up to the front door and it's locked and you're not home and you probably don't have a way to get a hold of them, that's a lot of worry. And if you just knew a few neighbors, somebody who worked from home, an elderly person who's retired that lives down the street, a family with a teenage kid who got off their bus 15 minutes before you, and you can make a quick phone call,
It would change everything.
that 5 minutes isn't as consequential. But when you don't have that, it affects everything. And we're doing that how many times a day where we feel like we can't mess up at all?
Well, what I'm wondering is that a societal generalization, or does that also have to do with how you're raised? Because when I think about that, for instance, the tennis shoes outside on the porch and just having to call your neighbors, for me in the States, it means that they're going to look at, one time is fine, but a couple of times they might get annoyed because of how individual we are and how much we're supposed to take care of ourselves. And so we don't want to make those mistakes because we don't want our neighbors to be annoyed at us. If we're living in a city, they're going to be annoyed because there's individualism. If we live in a small town, maybe even in the States, there's more community. I do know here, when, for instance, let's just go back to the passport. When my neighbor did that for me, I realized that I had to open up, that I had to make a huge shift, because what that meant here is that I need to be available whenever he needs me. And I thought, you know what, I can do that. But this is 20 years living in this culture. Before I could not do that. But when you ask for a favor in this culture, it means you need to be then immediately available to reciprocate. And they're not going to do anything onerous, but it means all of a sudden you're part of a community. And that's not easy for me. And it's not easy for me as an American, as you're talking about. But what can we do then in the States to let down our guard a little bit? Even if the society is telling us or celebrating individualism, what are some of the things we can do, Alex, to just become more communal without trying to change the world?
Well, I am trying to change the world. So at the root of this, that's what all this work is for. Something's got to change. Something's got to give. And I do think, though, that doing that building societal change is more of us deciding to ignore the way it should be or the norms that they currently are, and saying, these aren't serving us. You were asking if this is a generalization, if it's better in small towns, things like that. And I don't have the small towns versus cities stats, but I do know the stats show the one that's coming to mind, like 60% of people, and this isn't exactly related, but because I'd have to go look it up, right? 60% of people believe that they don't have a single person who truly knows them in the States.
Wow.
It's staggering. So I could go find stats on neighbors and things like that, but the loneliness epidemic, the place we are in of not feeling like we have anyone to depend on or call is pretty dire. And those stats are released everywhere, and it's the cause that so many people attribute to all sorts of huge societal issues. And that's why I created this podcast. It's things like go meet your neighbors, go offer to do little things like that, take out their trash or grab the mail if something's wrong or whatnot. Like, put it out there, lead by example, check in on people every once in a while, start talking with people about the fact that we need this, and you could even use this episode and say, the next time you are worried because you forgot to do something, just know I'm always happy to help out with those small tasks if you're in a situation. And even just naming it instead of saying, here's my number in case anything comes up, explain why you're doing that. Because I think that if more people start ignoring the way it should be or the way it is and doing these little things, that over time, that's going to add up. Because you might do that to one neighbor, and then that neighbor might realize, we don't really know anybody else on the block, on the street, and go maybe meet a few more people. And suddenly we have a bunch more connections than we had before. I really think it's the little things that add up.
Yeah. And if you don't mind, I'm going to make a huge jump here, but I listen to a lot of podcasts about near-death experiences. And what people say, almost all of them, they say, it's not acceptable to say hello to people you don't know. For instance, in New York, it was also not acceptable. And when I went to visit my parents in Florida, you have to say hello to people on the street. So what I learned here is you don't say hello to people on the street. It's not comfortable for me. So I've been doing a lot of work about what are we here for? Why are we here? And one of the things is talking about the little things, the little niceties we can do. Say hello to someone, even if they don't say hello.
Yeah.
Their smiles light me up. There are a lot of older people. Nobody might have said hello to them the whole day. And for me, it's such a little thing. Just good morning, good afternoon. Their faces light up. And as you say, maybe they'll do something later on that's really nice for someone else. Or not. It doesn't matter. But you did your job that day.
Yeah. Those small interactions. There are all sorts of studies on this. I've talked about it multiple times on the podcast, but science shows that we assume they aren't meaningful to other people. And in fact, science shows that we think that other people dislike those small interactions, but our brain is playing tricks on us. That is not, in fact, it. Science shows that people do enjoy those small interactions. They like the simple hellos. They, like when you're interacting with someone at maybe a service counter, checking out at the grocery store, and you ask them, how are you?
Exactly.
All the times. I do that all the time. And people say, oh, thanks for asking. Because they're so caught off guard because they maybe have had 100 interactions and nobody has paid them any attention all day. That stuff matters. It adds up. If you go back in the archives, the episode that I'm referring to here is episode 41. It's titled The Liking Gap, What It Is, Why It's Important, and How to Overcome It. Now, this episode is going to have more stats and studies and figures. It's going to have an overview of the liking gap. It's going to talk about how it's impacting your life. It's all the things. But the very briefest of summaries is that the liking gap is a way that our brain is playing tricks on us. It's convincing us, studies show, that our brain is convincing us that when we have these simple interactions with people, we believe that the other person didn't enjoy it, and therefore we're less likely to engage in them. But studies show that people do very much enjoy these simple interactions. So head back to episode 41 to learn more about that.
Just as I was talking about the near-death experiences, so I just wanted to add up that that's what they say. It's the little
Yes.
things. It's the people that they did the little things for, that they come and say, thank you so much for doing that. Thank you for mentioning my dress that day. Thank you for noticing I just bought glasses that day that look nice. The little things do matter a lot. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. So I do want to know, Donna, you said you've lived there for 20 years. And everybody's going to be different, right? We all come from our own backgrounds and whatever. How long do you think it took you to start to kind of tap into that community aspect when you
Yesterday
have been there? Okay.
Right.
Like I said,
No, it's taken me a long
different.
time. As I said, it wasn't until I moved here. I moved here a month later, or less than a month later. My little neighbor's father said, I'm going to help you redo your house. I was going to hire people. That's what Americans do. We hire people and we pay them to do the work. And when we come home, it's done. And the workers didn't show up. And he said, I'm going to help you have the house of your dreams. And I thought, what? And he did. He worked with me for 2 years, redoing my entire house. And
wow,
I was nervous pretty much the whole time. About a year and a half in, I started realizing that there were things I could do for him. But being an American, I was very, very conscious of the fact that I needed to do something for him. He did not expect it. So little by little, I mean, it's been a gradual process, but I would say that in the past 2 years or so we're going, 22 years in, but I am highly individual, and maybe someone else would not have taken so long. I know other Americans, expats here, that have married into the culture, and that's what they want. They want to be in a community. That was not my goal. I wanted a different experience. I didn't come here to make a family. I really was not emotionally ready. I needed to figure out and get rid of a lot of dark clouds in my life before I could add value to someone else's life. And so now that's happening. But again, it's a co-agreement. You can't just expect something from them. You need to also give back. And until you're ready to do that, don't dive in.
I was going to say, so in my book, I talk about how I actually don't like the term reciprocity. And in other parts of the world, that it might be fine. But in the US, I feel like reciprocity has really turned into this, I gave you a cookie, so you owe me a cookie kind of thing. Like it's a tit for tat.
Right.
It's an equal exchange mindset. And so not that the term is bad, but just to give people a new way to think about it, I talk about, instead of reciprocity, like, are you nourishing your community? And I use that word because then it allows you to really think about like what you have to give, what skills are easy, what, ways are easy for you to show up that somebody else may not, like they might need. They need those things you offer. And it can look different. Somebody can come and help you with your house and you can offer teaching lessons, cooking.
Exactly. Something I can do. Right.
Something you can do. It doesn't have to be the exact same thing. And it doesn't have to be the exact same monetary value. And it doesn't have to be the exact same time exchange, because that's what they need. And this is what you need. And you can both show up in ways that feel right. And that is nourishing the greater good. Similarly, in, let's say, you showing up with podcast resources, I'm just using that as an example, that could be affecting your friend's friend. They could be the one that really wants it. So it's kind of trusting that this greater web of people has what you need somewhere out there. And I use trusting, that word, very intentionally, because I think that's kind of what you're talking about, is like you have to trust that, one, what you can offer is valuable to other people, it's impactful to them, it's what they need. And two, you have to trust that by giving all that, when you need something, they'll show up with the thing you need. And it's a lot of trust.
It's a lot of trust. I appreciate how you're using that word, because I think that is really the core of what is happening here. He said to me specifically, I'm not doing this for any other reason that I want to. And he meant that. And what's satisfying for him is that not that I help his family, but that I help the neighbors when they need help. And it's just what you're saying. They need me to print something out on my printer because they don't have one. Or yesterday I spent hours with one of their daughters, helped her buy a plane ticket because that's what I know how to do. They've helped me fix my car, literally, so I don't have to go to the shop. So it's the trust issue. I want to help you with your car because I know when I need something, you'll use your skills for me. It's just like a relationship, Alex. This is why I haven't had a successful relationship, or I didn't in the past, because I was always expecting the exact reciprocity. And that's not how relationships work on the small or larger scale. So I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah. And, if you think about even the printing, let's think about the printing, right? To you, that seems like, I'm sure, such a small task because you already have the printer, you have the computer. Sure, tell me what to print. I'll hit print. That took 2 seconds. But for them, if they didn't have that, right, they might have to get on public transportation or get in their car, go a certain distance, log in on this machine. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Finally hit print, pay for it. And it's not even the cost, but the hassle versus the ease.
I suppose so. Yeah, I suppose so. And yet it's so simple for me. I'm thinking that is not equal. And maybe what you're saying is for them, it's equal.
Like we don't even know the value, I think, of the ways we can show up because that's the whole hope, I think, is that they're actually the simplest, easiest things for us because then we will want to keep giving. My personal example of that is cooking. I love to cook for people. I'll cook for you. I'll cook for my close friends, but I'll also cook for my friend's friend if I feel like I have the capacity to. And it's because I really love cooking. It's actually, a way I relax. It's enjoyable to me. Sometimes I want to cook and we really don't need more baked goods or freezer meals. So you're giving me the opportunity to do it for someone else. But if you don't like cooking or you don't have the capacity, that just seems like such a big way I'm giving, the time. Oh my gosh, the time to make these things. But I loved it. So to me, it just feels like a blink of an eye. And so if we can keep tapping into the things that are actually so easy for us to give, then we'll keep doing it.
It's a really nice qualifier. The other thing that came up for me while you're talking, and you probably say this a lot, and yet it hasn't come up yet in our conversation, that it's really important to know ourselves.
Yes.
And it's really important to be generous about how other people are acting. And I'm just learning this recently because I was brought up by someone who's very, very judgmental. And so I learned judgment. But I realize that people are doing the best they can. And I know that is very cliche to say. And yet I realize that everybody's best is a little different. But it's really important not to react to people, but to just remember that we're here to share energy. So your baking is really sharing your loving energy with people. Yeah, and I'm coming over to get some stuff from your freezer.
Yeah, come on over. But, that's me doing that idea of nourishing. Like I'm just putting this out there and doing that because it's easy for me allows for my other friends to show up in the ways they show up with ease because they don't have to scramble for this. Similarly, you being able to print something or help buy the plane tickets online is maybe now, right, allowing someone's kid to go on a school trip. And that's going to bring more knowledge back to the people that live around here and expand. Like that has a repercussion multiple levels out into the community. And so I try and remember that too.
Everything we do has ripples, either negative or positive. Everything has ripples. And so we may not know 99% of the effect we have on the universe, let's say. And yet, I think that it's really important to realize that we do have an effect. And there was this great quote someone just sent me. It was, believe that everything you do matters. because it does.
Mm.
I mean, I know that, and yet it's so powerful reading it.
Yeah.
So anytime we can remember in a very small community, it's very important to remember that people are going to react differently depending on how they woke up, how their husband spoke with them, how their children didn't do what they wanted them to do, anything, how their dog made a mess on the floor. And we don't know what happened before they came and spoke to us in a way that triggered us. And if we can bring our own energy down and just remember we're all doing the best we can, we will send those ripples out again, smooth ripples over. And I know, Alex, I know this sounds so easy, but this is what I wake up thinking, all right, I'm going to try to do this even better today.
It sounds easy. It sounds easy. But in practice, it's not. Because, well, at least in the States, at least those of us that were raised to like have certain beliefs of how we should act, it's not, because we're going against the grain, number one. And number two, we have to trust in a way that we haven't been taught to trust. We've been taught to only trust ourselves and maybe a select few. So it really is a lot of work to choose to act differently. But what I would remind people, and I say this, is you get to choose your hard. It's hard to change the way we're acting, even in the smallest ways. Like sometimes those are actually the hardest things to change. It's also hard to continue to have that hypervigilance of never being able to mess up. They're both hard. Neither one is better than the other. Go ahead and do whatever you want. But we're just more used to one version of hard.
Yeah. And it just makes me think about culture again. And as I say, I still see through the lens of an American, although I am a global citizen. I see myself letting go of cultural identifiers. Someone said to me, what do you hang on to about being an American? I said, I try to let go of as much as possible, because letting go is where the connection comes in. And so if I can let go of how I was raised, the things that don't work now, and if I can let go of what doesn't work culturally on a global scale, then I am finding more connection with my neighbors. I become more understanding. So what is it in these conversations, Alex? I'm going to ask you a question. What is it in these conversations? What is your ideal goal? What would you love for these conversations is the ripple effect to create?
I mean, I hope that these conversations, I hope that they're exponential. I hope that these conversations reach tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who then go out and make even a few small connections or changes. And if we can do that, what would the cultural shift look like? How much more connected would we feel? That 60% stat that I mentioned earlier, could we get it down to 50, 40, 30?
How much do you think the digital age is helping that?
I think that quite often we talk about in-person and virtual connection as if they're different. And I really think it's the same, but we just need to start seeing technology as a tool. So if you're not interacting with people when you walk around and smiling at them, you're probably also the same person who's going through social media and looking at things where you never interact or comment or like or message.
Wow, that's a wonderful observation. Okay.
So although you might feel connected because you're watching other people's lives, you're still being passive. You're not putting yourself out there. You're not taking a little bit of a risk. You're not taking that time to comment a thoughtful comment and say, I am so happy your family was able to go on that trip. Looks lovely. That's so similar to when you walk down the street and smile at someone and tell them their glasses look nice. And I would bet most people are not thinking of it that way. Like technology is just a tool. You still have to put yourself out there.
Yeah, and it would be really nice. Someone recommended this to me and I try to do it. I think I succeed in doing it every day. I get on social media because a lot of my business is digital now. But every day I have to write 3
Mhm.
positive comments to people. And it's so easy to fall back into a passive mode, just what you're saying. And so when I say I have to, it is an obligation for me. I have to remember it's not just reading and thinking, oh, that's gorgeous. I need to write it and connect with them, because you're absolutely right. It's the energetic connection, whether in person or digitally, it still works. We need to find our people, and that can be done online now, which is golden.
Yeah, I think we just have a lot of opportunities. And it's conversations like this, my hope, that open our eyes to the small shifts we could be making that are hopefully going to make those ripples, whether it's in person, moving across the world, online, wherever that is. We can do that. We have the power to shift our behavior.
That's right.
And
Because
make
wherever
those
we
changes for
go,
ourselves.
we are there. And we're going to bring everything from our
Correct.
past with us. And so wherever we are, we can change our reality. Oh, again, I'm speaking in cliches, and yet
Mm.
you know that I mean them much more profoundly.
Yeah, sometimes it's how it's
Yeah,
supposed to be
yeah.
on here. Like we're talking about big things. Donna, I want to thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation. I think it was really beautiful. And I really do think it's going to get people thinking about how they're acting in their day-to-day life, the actions they're taking.
I hope so. What I most want are people to connect positively. So if that helps even a little bit, then I've done my work today. And it's been just so lovely speaking with you, Alex. I love what you're trying to do. And I can't wait to see how it's going to, not just ripples, waves all over the place.
Waves. Yeah. I really love conversations like today's, the ones where it feels like we could just be sitting around the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, trying to explore life's deeper meanings or unearth some new layer of ourselves. These are my favorite. So thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. Thanks for considering. I would love any further conversation you have about this. Shoot me a message or an email. I want to talk about it. I also want to mention that Donna put together some materials for all of us. She said to me that they will generate fascinating conversations about cultural differences, why people might misinterpret signals, and how that affects a natural union of communities. This is all related to her teachings and her work. So head on down to the show notes and go give those a download if you want to explore this a little further. With that, I'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Friendship IRL. I am so honored to have these conversations with you, but don't let the chat die here. Send me a voice message. I created a special website just to chat with you. You can find it at alex.chat. You can also find me on Instagram. My handle at it's Alex Alexander, or go ahead and leave a review wherever you prefer to listen to podcasts. Now, if you want to take this conversation a step further, send this episode to a friend. Tell them you found it interesting, and use what we just talked about as a conversation starter the next time you and your friend hang out. No need for a teary goodbye. I'll be back with a new episode next week.